What's up, hockey fans? Welcome into the latest edition of the NHL Insider Notebook here on the BR app, streaming live as well on YouTube. I'm your host, Frank Seravalli, and it's Tuesday at 1:30, so that means we're talking all things pucks just 1 week out from the beginning of NHL training camps. The top players in the league have descended on Las Vegas this week for their annual player media tour. So there's been lots of news and information to get to, and we'll cover it all. But let's make this interactive. I want to hear from you. Questions, comments, concerns, excitement about the upcoming season. Just about 1 month away from puck drop in the opening night of the regular season. When hockey's right around the corner. So let's dive in, but let's make this interactive. As I mentioned, let's dive in with the news of the day, which is from the 7th round to $7.5 million a year. The Calgary Flames signed goaltender Dustin Wolf to a 7-year, $52.5 million contract extension on Tuesday morning, and it's a mostly unprecedented deal. This is a goaltender who has, yes, played outside of the entry-level system on the contract that he was on last year, a two-way deal. But look, to have this limited number of games played, 71 career games for Dustin Wolf, to sign for $52.5 million is a big, big deal in NHL circles. It signals a number of things. First and foremost being the Calgary Flames' complete and total belief in the goaltender that Dustin Wolf is. And when you look at his pedigree, it's hard to argue against that. You take a look at the work that he's done in the American Hockey League 2 years in a row as the MVP. Most outstanding goaltender. Then you look at his rookie season in the NHL with the Flames last year. You could have presented a case for a team that was knocking on the door of the Stanley Cup playoffs last year that Dustin Wolf could have or should have been the NHL's Rookie of the Year. He was on my ballot for sure, but with the Flames falling just short of the playoffs, for me, I had to go in a different direction. Nonetheless, an incredibly impressive regular season. And so for 71 career games played to get $52.5 million, it also signals the significant increase in the NHL's salary cap that is coming. If you're going to have to make a decision to keep a goaltender long term, I subscribe to just a very few rules in the contract world. For goalies, limited term, and unless you have someone very special, then you can exceed that and go into the different category. But generally not more than 3 to 4 years for a goalie. For Wolf, you've just purchased all of the very best years of Dustin Wolf's prime if you're the Calgary Flames. Makes total sense. And with the cap rising, and when you look at some of the other contracts that have been signed already recently, resetting the backup goalie market, well, $7.5 million for the future sounds really quite reasonable for Dustin Wolf. So love the approach from the Calgary Flames, getting a core centerpiece of your team locked up for the foreseeable future. And to give it some perspective, I said mostly unprecedented. Well, there's been a couple big deals that have been signed directly out of the rookie contract, the entry-level contract system, but not very many to get this sort of total dollars and AAV. So this surpasses like Igor Shesterkin and Carter Hart and a lot of other younger goalies that have been able to make a dent in the NHL. And my friend Paul Paduti at Adjusted Hockey on Twitter, if you follow his work, he does an unbelievable job putting everything in context. And he says, with the Calgary Flames signing Dustin Wolf, there have been 19 goalies in the salary cap era who have played 50 to 100 career games by their age 23 season. Yes, we know that it takes goalies longer to develop. So Wolf is in that company. And when you look at some of the other names on the list, it's a mostly pretty excellent group. Henrik Lundqvist, Tuukka Rask, UC Saros, Stanley Cup winner Braden Holtby's in that group. Jeremy Swayman, you saw the deal that he just signed with the Boston Bruins this time last year. Jake Ottinger, Robin Lehner, Spencer Knight. There's been lots of goalies. Connor Hellebuck is on that list that make up the current core of today's NHL that have broken into the league by age 23, made an impact, and the Flames have said, hey, we've seen enough to know that this guy is the real deal, and kind of hard to argue with that. What do you think about Dustin Wolf's contract? I think it's going to work out really quite nicely for the Flames. Jamal Sampson 89 in our YouTube chat says, can't wait for hockey season 2025. I wonder how the Kraken do this year. It's a good question. Jamal, I really can't answer that. I would expect them to be in kind of the same neighborhood that the Kraken have been in recently, which is somewhere from 5th to 8th in their division. But I'm really curious to see what kind of stamp that Jason Botterill begins to put on this team as he begins to remake it. How active will they be at the deadline? This is a changing of the guard from inaugural GM Ron Francis to Jason Botterill doing it his own way, and not a ton of huge changes. They want to add more scoring. That is certainly for sure, but weren't really able to get their hands on that this summer. And so I think the Kraken remain, Jamal, a work in progress. So speaking of one big deal that's gotten done with Dustin Wolf, a somewhat surprise extension coming on the eve of training camp with training camp being a week away. Could we see another one, another historic deal, another trendsetter deal? And I'm nodding my head yes. I'm thinking that it's very possible that we see a Kirill Kaprizov extension with the Minnesota Wild materialize over the next week. I believe this to be a pretty significant week for Kaprizov and the Wild as their talks have been ongoing. And what kind of range are we talking about for Kaprizov? How about the new high water mark in the NHL in terms of AAV? My prediction all along has been Kirill Kaprizov, 8 years, times 15 million, around $120 million, which is just a massive, massive contract. It wouldn't be the richest in total dollars, I don't think, in NHL history. I think Alex Ovechkin has that title from back when you could sign those mega 12 and 14-year deals. But this would be the new high watermark if it gets done, and I expect it to before camp opens for Kaprizov with the Wild. That is just a massive number. So then it resets everything. What happens? What kind of effect, if at all, does that have on the Jack Eichel talks with the Vegas Golden Knights? What effect, if at all, does it have on the Connor McDavid talks with the Edmonton Oilers? In parentheses, I'm going to say nothing, because Connor McDavid is in a class of his own, and whatever number he writes down on a piece of paper, whenever he's ready to have those discussions with the Edmonton Oilers, that will be that. That will be the end of it. And the Edmonton Oilers will simply just nod their head yes and say, thank you. We'll get that papered up for you. That's as simple as that. But when it comes to Kaprizov, it's hard to kind of imagine what the Wild would look like if he isn't there. And I think that this is the start of a really interesting season for Minnesota, because if Kaprizov is healthy and he's back to the level that we know that he can play at from start to finish, when you look at some of the younger guys that they have continuing to take steps forward, Brock Faber, up front, Matt Boldy, they've got a young, talented core of players that now finally has some cap flexibility, and they've got a great prospect base to play from, that I think you're going to look at this team in the very near future and say that this is one of the top contending teams in the West. They might not be there this year, but I think in real short order, you're going to be talking about the Wild in that category, that they've sort of very methodically and slowly put all this together, and they're in a spot to be really successful. First order of business is getting that Kaprizov deal done for the foreseeable future. My prediction, again, 8 years times 15 million. Bill Agnew wants to know, how many years is the Luke contract? Don't know yet. Davis Chad 5 wants to know, any Blackhawks news? Been relatively quiet on the Blackhawks front. I think they're, looking at their last sort of remaining piece of business here with Wyatt Kaiser, getting him into camp and making sure that that happens on time. You would think that that'd be something relatively easy to do, but it has gone on for a while. Live Lee wants to know, is $52.5 million in overpay? Swayman contract is killing the Bruins. I don't think so. Look, the Flames, Lee, they had some of the most cap space in the NHL last season among teams that were competitive. They started the year with $18.5 million, and they didn't really spend it as the year went on. Again, think rising cap. That also means rising floor, which means the minimum that you have to spend in any given year. So if you're going to be making decisions on who to hand that money out to, as opposed to blowing your wad in free agency and overpaying someone that's north of 30 years old, doesn't it make sense to give some of that money in what could be a value deal for the long haul to a guy that you really believe in, that you've drafted and developed, that you can keep in Calgary and can be part of that team from the opening of the new building in a couple years and beyond? I know we're all excited for what that new building looks like in Calgary, the Scotia Place. It's going to be lights out. What about that playoff salary cap? How about that? That was a big topic from last week. We broke the news actually just minutes after our stream ended. Got a flurry of messages from people around the NHL world saying, hey, have you heard of the new rules that have been put in place to smooth over this transition from one CBA to the next? And the biggest one of that being that, yes, this season upcoming, starting in a few weeks, there will be a salary cap in the Stanley Cup playoffs. The formula has been set going back to the negotiations. It's somewhat convoluted and complicated to explain. It essentially boils down to the 18 skaters and 2 goaltenders that you're putting on the ice for that night's action in the Stanley Cup playoffs must be cap compliant. And there's also limitations to LTIR and how you can go out and spend that money for players that might ultimately be returning. You essentially get a number that's prorated based on the average annual salary from the previous season. So it is a little convoluted. But suffice to say, it has created a sort of lightning rod of criticism from fan bases around the league saying, hey, look at you, Vegas Golden Knights or Florida Panthers or Tampa Bay Lightning or whatever team that you want to pick on and say, what you've done in the past didn't work. And it's kind of obvious to see that the league, whether those teams were cap compliant or not based on the new rules, they also saw that as an issue to the point where it has been negotiated in this collective bargaining agreement to try and clamp down on that and make for as fair competition as possible, that no matter who you're adding to the course of your roster over a season, and perhaps the Panthers will be facing a little bit of that again, depending on the status and health of Matthew Tkachuk, who won't be starting the season over the first 2 to 3 months after undergoing hip adductor surgery. These are all going to be part of the calculations moving forward as teams get closer to the deadline. People have said, hey, this means now that we're going to see less or fewer transactions. I don't know that that's the case. I think with some clearly defined rules now, what we could see is teams try and find some other ways to be creative or find some leverage or loopholes to be able to maybe stack a few players. It just doesn't mean you can't acquire them. It just means that the roster that you ice that night needs to be cap compliant. What if someone wants to stack someone on the sideline to then put a player in should there be an injury? We know injuries happen all the time over the course of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Maybe someone is out there looking for an insurance piece that they decide to try and do this a little bit differently. Let's take a peek at our chats here. Is Jack Roslovic going to sign soon, and who's still looking at him? Man, I thought Jack Roslovic coming off of a great season was going to be in a fine spot to earn a pretty significant contract. Obviously, this has taken way longer than they probably anticipated. I would say that the number of teams that have been interested, you've got your contenders that are sort of looking to see if Jack Roslovic is willing to bet on himself and take a short-term, short money deal to go out and repeat the success that he had last year in Carolina. I don't think the door is 100% completely closed in Carolina, but they don't really have the roster space to bring him back. So one of the teams that I'd keep an eye on, and I'm going to say it again, is the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think they've had discussions. I think the Vancouver Canucks have been monitoring this situation pretty closely as well. But I don't think that's an exhaustive or exclusive list. And I think that there's been some progress and traction recently on the Jack Roslovic front. Davis Chad in here again. What does $15 million a year do for a Bedard deal? Honestly, I think the Bedard contract extension talks, which they have not really engaged in talks on either side to this point, to my knowledge, the tenor of that might be set not so much by a deal like a Kaprizov one, because Bedard has never really been in that category of player. But let's see how this season goes relative to Frank Nazar and the deal that he signed with the Hawks, a sort of definitely unprecedented contract for a player that still had one more year left on his rookie deal and scored, I think, a grand total of 13 NHL goals, $46+ million and change. That is a more interesting starting point for the Hawks relative to how these two guys play side by each this upcoming season to then figure out where that next Bedard contract goes. What happened to Calvin DeHaan? He used to be a sought-after defenseman. I think he's a guy that has just run into father time. Michael Stevens asked, any insight on the Wyatt Kaiser signing holdup? We talked a little bit about this last week. Part of this was related to the experience and numbers that Kaiser has had. They're actually pretty good. Part of this is related to the defense marketplace as a whole and sort of the limited number of games played that I think sort of impacts everything. I mentioned this, and this is just me spitballing when I say this, but last week, if you're in Wyatt Kaiser's camp and you've got some other comps that you're looking at, Louis Crevier signs a 2-year deal at $900,000 on the Blackhawks blue line. Okay, Kaiser, his resume is better, his experience is more, he's probably going to be a bigger part of the lineup moving forward. But somewhere between 1.3 to 1.5 as a starting point, like, this should not be that complicated. We are not reinventing the wheel. This would seem to be one that you would think would just get done rather quickly. Any news on Luke Hughes and the New Jersey Devils? Nope. But it was interesting to hear Jack Hughes today at the NHL Player Media Tour talking to reporters. Just say point blank, yes, I'll be honest, I would like to play with Quinn, his brother, who's out in Vancouver. Of course they would. Thank you for the honesty, Jack, and stating the obvious. The other part then would be getting Luke done and a deal. Look, I think this looks and starts with a Brock Faber type number, but I wonder if the deal that Jack signed, also long-term, big money from a few years ago, does that impact at all how the Hughes family looks at this? Because it was great to get that $64, $68 million, $66 million, whatever he signed for, and get that security. But I think at a certain point in time when you follow that up with a 100-point season, that you then feel like, hey, this was, and we've been underpaid. And I know that's, you can't have it both ways. Either you take the security or you're willing to, play it out and place a wager on yourself. But just an interesting sort of tidbit to try and gain some line of sight into the thinking of the Hughes family as they try and figure this contract out for Luke. I mean, it's still going to be a pretty sizable deal regardless. 2 40-plus point seasons on the blue line, 2 seasons north of 21 minutes a night. He is a significant part of what the New Jersey Devils want to do moving forward. It's been their top offseason priority to get that deal done all summer. Obviously, this has lingered, but man, it also makes you look at a Dougie Hamilton contract that's on the books and say, that's a really tough spot to be in. How do we find a way to get out from under that contract? How do we find a way to lessen the load on our defensemen relative to cap with that Dougie Hamilton contract? Because it all has to fit together like puzzle pieces for Tom Fitzgerald and Coach Sheldon Keefe. With the lack of movement in Pittsburgh, Patrick wants to know, do you think they would look to deal guys like Danton Heinen or Noel Acciari, or would they be more likely to hit waivers and wait for training camp to play out? Look, I think Heinen and Acciari have both been longtime favorites of GM Kyle Dubas. I think they're in a spot where they've got to make some decisions. Kyle Dubas spoke to Pierre LeBrun from The Athletic in a story about Sidney Crosby and said their goal is to return the Pittsburgh Penguins to contention as urgently as possible. But in the short term, they're going to have to make some decisions. And the key should be trying to unload some vets that are older, that make big money so that they can begin to turn this over. But that is, of course, easier said than done. And certainly part of what the Penguins are going to have to sift through this year, as it also relates to Sidney Crosby. So what is going on with Sidney Crosby? Perfect segue into the Pittsburgh Penguins. And that is, well, there have been these rumors that have been floating out there for months on end. Sidney Crosby wants to be a forever Penguin. Sidney Crosby has experienced a downturn for the Penguins, being out of contention somewhat early. And he spoke to reporters at the NHL Player Media Tour in Vegas, and reiterated a little bit of that frustration. And he said, specifically as it related to the Montreal Canadiens, I get why it would come up and that sort of thing. It doesn't make it any easier when you're losing to hear those things, but at the same time, to know that a team like that, meaning Montreal, wants you, it's not the end of the world. It could be worse. So really kind of interesting quote. This is the childhood favorite team of Sidney Crosby. He reiterated in that conversation with reporters in Vegas his love for the Montreal Canadiens, and I'd have to think that being faded by the Bell Center crowd last year at Four Nations Face-Off, which just being in the building makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, that had to feel good. And there's zero doubt also, like, let's be totally clear that the Montreal Canadiens would do anything to get their hands on Sidney Crosby, even at this age, with how productive and consistent he's been, plus the leadership caliber and quality that he brings. They'd be all for it. But I think the Penguins are in a spot where they're not going to approach their captain who wants to be a forever Penguin. It's going to be up to Sidney Crosby to raise his hand and say, I'd like to move on. And just listening to his comments and also listening to the comments from his agent in CAA's Pat Brisson, that doesn't appear to be happening anytime soon. However, no one has really officially closed the door on it and said, hey, that's never going to happen. They just said this is a conversation that will continue to evolve. I also tend to believe that it's not one that would happen mid-season, so I'm not expecting something this year. But who knows what 1 year's time will play out like, what next summer will play out like, because that has certainly been percolating under the surface. And a lot of people have said, oh, well, wouldn't Sidney Crosby just go to Denver to play with Nathan MacKinnon in Colorado? I think the Canadiens, for a lot of different reasons, a team on the rise, a team that desperately wants him, a place that he's familiar with, a place that there's some nostalgia for him growing up a Habs fan and his dad being a Habs fan, that might check a lot of boxes, also playing in Canada to close out his career. But he's never verbalized that publicly to anyone. And to be honest, from everyone that I could talk to that's in Sidney Crosby's orbit, he's never actually really verbalize that to anyone privately either. This is a guy who's so laser focused on trying to make the Pittsburgh Penguins as best as possible, and he has certainly held up his end of the bargain there. Let's see. Have you heard the latest comments on Rasmus Andersson? This is from James Gordon. What are the chances the Flames end up signing him after all? Sounds like it's still on the table, especially if the Flames start hot. I don't think it's on the table, James. I think the Flames have set a number for Rasmus Andersson. I think his ask and what he sees on the market is way north of that. They also don't want to entangle themselves while they're still kind of rebuilding. I don't know if would you use that R word for a team that just finished a couple points shy, but they have a clear master plan. I don't see that Anderson's necessarily a fit there. He's also coming off of what I would describe as a pretty average season for him. And he's someone that will, regardless, even with an average season for a guy that scores double-digit goals every year, has a physical edge and some bite to his game, is a right-shot defenseman who is pretty mobile and skates well, like, he's going to get paid. And so the Flames, I think, have drawn a line and said that they don't plan on that. Could something change? Yes. But what was really important from the comments today made by Rasmus Andersson at the Flames annual charity golf outing is that there were some reports out there over the summer that had indicated, oh, he's only interested in playing for one team. I think the team that was talked about a lot was the Vegas Golden Knights. He had mentioned specifically that he's had multiple conversations with Flames GM Craig Conroy and that he would never do that to the team, saying that he wouldn't handcuff them and just give them one team. He wants the team, if he is moving on, to be in the best position possible to cash in. I think earlier this summer, I'm not saying now, but earlier this summer, the Dallas Stars were one of those teams that had interest. I think the list is a lot longer than that, but no one really hit the Flames asking price in terms of what they're looking for. And they weren't really under any rush, because now let's look forward to March 6th and the trade deadline in 2026. And all of a sudden you look at it and you go, they could have the premier trade chip on their hands. I think the only interesting part, James, is what happens if the Flames are in contention. It's going to be a really difficult decision for them to, cut their team's legs off at the knees to then try and look at that and say, hey, well, we're cashing in for the future if it hurts their playoff chances for this upcoming season. But they've got a lot of work to do between now and then to prove that the success that they had last season was not a fluke. I think they're a scrappy team, a team that no one really believed in and had expectations for last year, and the power of that took them a long way. Can they really struggle to score goals the way that they did last year, or will that rebound in a big way? Connor Zary also inking an extension as well earlier this week, 3 times $3,775, if my numbers are correct off the top of my head. And yeah, just to quickly wrap up on a few other things, a lack of RFA offer sheets. I think a lot of people have been saying, "Hey, Frank, what happened to the year of the offer sheets, the summer of the offer sheets?" Well, a lot of those guys were taken off the table really kind of relatively early in the process, and some teams made moves to avoid even getting to those situations where offer sheets could be a thing. Think of the Buffalo Sabres moving JJ Peterka to Utah Mammoth. That happened in part because, yes, Peterka wasn't going to be re-signing in Buffalo, but also because of the threat of the offer sheet. People have said, why not an offer sheet for Mason McTavish? Bobby Bowe is in here asking, what's going on with Mason McTavish? What's the asking price? It's not going to be cheap, but it's hard to offer sheet a team like the Anaheim Ducks, who has so much salary cap space. How could you possibly create a poison pill enough that you're also not taking a wild swing yourself on a player who might not live up to the number that you'd be trying to poach him at? That also makes it really difficult for Anaheim to match. So when you take a look at all those things, not really surprised the way that the market continued to evolve, that there weren't offer sheets, but I'm sure that there were teams that had a much longer and juicier list going back to March, April, and May when we were trying to set the table for the offseason, and that was in vogue in terms of topics around the league, thinking that we might see some action on that front. And I think we will in the future, because I think what has been proven with Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg moving from Edmonton to St. Louis is that it actually can be a tool to acquire players, whereas previously they were just kind of always matched. And so if you can find the right situation, you might be able to find your hands around two pretty solid players that are right in the prime and heart of their careers. What else is going on here in our chat? It's really been kind of quiet for just a week away from training camp. Expect those topics and more to heat up in a pretty big way. Quick Olympic check-in. There was some rumblings after the orientation camp for Team USA. Why wasn't Lane Hudson invited? His dad, Rob, appeared on a podcast and mentioned, sort of offhand and off book, hey, just a reminder that my kids are Canadian. And so he said, end quote, "I don't know what Bill Guerin was thinking." And the comments were pretty, I guess, incendiary in a sense that when you listen to them on the whole, it's kind of pretty rare for a current player's parent to speak out in light of an ongoing situation, particularly, given the stature of Lane Hudson and the season that he had last year, winning that Rookie of the Year. Let me say a couple things. One, I totally understand Rob Hudson's frustration. I think you look at the year that your son had and you say he absolutely belongs in that category of player that was invited to the Team USA Olympic orientation camp in Plymouth, Michigan. And I think the other part that can be true at the same time is that Rob Hudson should not have been near a microphone and should not have been saying that out loud, and certainly should not have been hinting at the idea that his players or his son, Lane Hudson, and his other kids could defect and play for Canada after investing so much time growing up in the Chicagoland area to then also be part of the USA Hockey experience. That part can also be true, that he was right to feel annoyed or frustrated that he wasn't there, but also shouldn't be thinking or saying those things out loud. That part can be true at the same time. So I think this will quiet down in a big way, and a lot of it will also be up to Lane Hudson. Can he go out and duplicate a lot of the success that he had last year in a phenomenal and historic rookie season? I believe he can. I believe he's an incredible special talent. I do believe he'll be on the 2030 Team USA Olympic team. And I also think that in a crazy world, if, I don't know, Quinn Hughes or Adam Fox or someone is not healthy when it comes to the Olympics, that's the type of player that could get a look if he starts off on the same foot that he did last year. But for the meantime, I think everyone's hoping that this story and topic simmers down. With that, that'll do it for today's edition of the NHL Insider Notebook here on the BR app. It was great to be with you. Thanks a lot for throwing your questions, comments, and concerns in the chat. I'm NHL Insider Frank Seravalli, and we'll be back next week, Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, to do it all over again, this time with training camps just on the eve of opening. Can't wait. Hockey is around the corner. We'll talk to you then.